This is MiAfrica Talks. My name is Ken Stewart. I'm Director of International Affairs at UN House in Scotland and Director of Strategy at MiEscape. MiAfrica Talks will deliver a series of programs where we look at international development issues in Africa and how we must improve our delivery of international development. This particular program we start and launched series is called Transforming African Farming, which is about delivering groundbreaking harvests and also delivering groundbreaking jobs. You will have already watched a most interesting film by the award-winning Mike Goldwater entitled Trees Mean Life, prior to this program starting now. And featured in Mike's excellent program was Professor Roger Leakey, who is Vice Chairman of the International Trees Foundation. Sitting next to Roger is Chioma Obiani-Inwa, who is a journalist, a broadcaster, and an entrepreneurial farmer. She's also the sheet anchor of Silverbird television series in Nigeria. On her left is Festus Otulandi, who is the chairman of the Centre for African Policy Research and Development here in Scotland. Now, this is going to be a very interesting discussion. Perhaps it might be controversial at particular moments, but it should be illuminating for all those who are going to enjoy this program. Most recently, Kofi Annan and Goodluck Jonathan, the President of Nigeria, commented that it is imperative for farming to transform from the subsistence basis it currently operates and improve and become more entrepreneurial. And if it could improve and reach certain levels, then it might answer one of the great problems the world has today, and that is food insecurity. Roger, I think I'd like to start by asking you to deliver a short piece on your concept of how we could go about improving yield and improving harvest in sub-Saharan Africa, based on your book, Living with the Trees of Life. Roger, perhaps you might start by the history of early colonial influence in farming in Africa and then bring us up to date. Roger.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we really have to understand the problem before we try to come up with solutions. And frequently, I think people forget about the problem when they try to develop solutions. So I think we need to recognize that ever since colonial times, people have been telling African farmers what they should be doing. Often people from other parts of the world who have actually no experience of African soils, African wildlife, the biodiversity, the social systems, the fact that the farmers don't actually have access to income. There's no social support system. So it's very, very different. In Africa, the situation for farmers is totally different from the farmers in other parts of the world, particularly in the industrial countries. So we need to start from that base. And I think the problem that has arisen is that the conventional industrial agricultural systems that have been promoted over the last 100 years or so have basically not been totally relevant to the needs of the farmers, because those farmers basically only have access to, say, $1 or $2 per day of income. And so being asked to spend money on fertilizers and pesticides and irrigation, it really is a non-starter.
But the African farmers were there before the colonists arrived. And how has this situation arisen?
Well, people of Africa originally, like people everywhere else in the world, were hunter-gatherers, collecting products from natural vegetation systems. And then, yes, farming slowly emerged. And often that really started to happen at about the time of the colonialism. And so the model which has been developed is one based on temperate agriculture. And as I say, that's inappropriate, because if you haven't got money to spend on the inputs, You develop your farming, you plant your seeds, yields go down year on year on year on year. And we end up with a system where the land is totally degraded, and because those farmers are living outside of the cash economy, they can't implement the model.
So these farmers were following the colonial model.
They were following a model brought in from outside by outsiders, basically, yes.
Yep, they were living very comfortably, very healthily before the colonial powers arrived.
Well, they were subsistence people, yes, but they did have access to pretty much all of their daily needs, except, of course, for the benefits that now can come from the cash economy. So business leading to jobs, leading to opportunities to greatly improve people's income. And so what we need to do is to see how we can see a form of agriculture that meets the needs of the people, as well as progress into a more integrated rural development that benefits people all over the continent, but also has global benefits.
So these farmers nowadays are growing crops which suits the requirements of the West.
Well, they also meet the needs, the starch needs of the farmers themselves. Most of the commercial, conventional crops are things like maize and rice and cassava, all starch-based staple crops. Then the next tier is the export crops, things like tea, coffee, cocoa. And so some farmers have access into those cash crops as well. But the purely subsistence farmers, who make up hundreds of millions of farmers in Africa, basically are still very much at the lower end, trapped in poverty, malnutrition, and hunger. It's an interesting statistic that I think it's 80% of Africa's farmers suffer from malnutrition. These are the people that are growing the food. They should be the best fed, and they're so very badly fed.
And if the soil is degrading, it must be costing more in fertilizer to try and produce the yield required year upon year.
If they could buy fertilizer, but they can't afford fertilizer, so yes, they need alternative ways of generating soil fertility.
So how did you look at solving or coming up with a solution to this problem?
Well, I can't claim that for myself, but there have been people around now in the field of agroforestry for some 30, 40 years, looking to see how you use leguminous trees and shrubs to become, if you like, an improved fallow. Let me explain what a fallow is, perhaps. In the old days, when people were hunter-gatherers and they started growing crops, then they did what's called shifting agriculture. So you cleared a bit of forest, you planted your crops, you took harvest for 2 or 3 years, and then you let the forest reinvade the area for a period of 15 or 20 years to restore its fertility before you then cropped it again. In those systems, then nature restored soil fertility. And that period of nature is what we know as a fallow. Now, what we're saying is that by using these leguminous trees and shrubs, which you can plant as a crop, if you like, you can restore that nitrogen level in 2 to 3 years to get to a maize crop, which will have gone up from something like 1 ton per hectare to 4 or 5 tons per hectare. So huge
difference. And if that harvest produces more than they need just to sustain themselves, they could sell the harvest.
Yes, so this is in effect is the first step of 3 steps that I have advocated in my book. So the first step is how do we solve the basic problem of food security by improving the yield of staple crops. Then, interestingly, when we went to see the farmers in Cameroon 20 odd years ago and asked them what they would really like to see from agriculture, first of all, they were very surprised to be asked because, of course, they've normally been told what they should do. But when they thought about it, they said, well, what we would really like to do is to be able to cultivate the species that we used to gather from the forest when we were hunter-gatherers. So we would like to have the indigenous, the traditionally important, the culturally important fruits, nuts, leaves, and the medicines from barks and things of that sort. We would like to be able to grow those in our farming system as additional crops. Now, the advantage of that is that if you grow your maize crop, if you boost your maize yield from 1 to 5 tons, you actually free up some land that you can then put in other crops. And these other crops can be either the traditional cash crops of tea, coffee, cocoa, or they can be some of these indigenous fruits and nuts. And indeed, many of those fruits and nuts can be the shade crops that are over the tea and the coffee and the cocoa, because most of those species, most of those cash crops actually appreciate some shade. So you can have a multiple tiered system of your food crop, your staple food, your cash crop, and then the tree crops providing additional new crops.
So you've actually used this model. This model has been tried and tested.
So this was 20 years ago. Farmers said they wanted that, and we said yes. We're very pleased to try and help you to do that, but we want you to do it in a way that is entirely that all the benefits flow back to you in the community. We don't want to be boosting rich people's incomes. We want to be helping subsistence farmers to grow towards the cash economy. So we want to be able to provide you with skills, provide you with information and understanding of how to develop your farming system in this multiple tiered system based around both food crops and perennial crops.
So let me just get this straight. So they start off being subsistence farmers, but by employing the model that you've just described, they can actually become entrepreneurs. They can actually produce enough produce to take it to the market, to create markets, and to perhaps even look at other products.
Yes, that becomes the third step in my series. So our first one was restoring the soil fertility. The second one was establishing these indigenous fruits and nuts both to have ecological benefit in the farming system, because trees have huge impacts on biodiversity and life cycles, the food chain, restoring all of that, and then producing the products, which are then marketable. They're, of course, crucial importance to people's domestic lives as well. So the farmer will decide whether to consume those products or to sell them, and they may decide to consume some and sell surplus. Hopefully they're going to be able to produce enough to have more than they can consume, and therefore it becomes an opportunity then to see how to restore and improve the shelf life of those products. So many of the fruits, this one, for example, the African plums, safu as it's called in Cameroon, that's the sort of variation that you find in a wild population of trees, because trees are exactly like people in terms of the tree-to-tree diversity is like human person-to-person diversity. So within a tree population, you have as much diversity as you can see in our audience and on our panel today. Identifying which of the trees in that wild population meets the need of your domestic demand, meets the need of a particular industry, perhaps oils for cosmetics, or maybe a medicinal product, maybe even things like parts for motor cars. There's a whole series of new products coming in now, made from tropical tree products that are used in car manufacture. A whole series of new things. So if we see that there's this growing market, then we can tailor our selection of the best trees to meet different markets. And even within a single species, you might be able to develop some cultivars which are good for eating, other cultivars which are perhaps good for oil extraction, other cultivars, and that oil may be good for food oil, or maybe good for cosmetics, or maybe good for medicine. So we can start to see you can build a series of industries around this kind of diversified farming system.
Okay, so let me just get this straight. So if you've planted your leguminous plants and you've brought the soil back to a pristine, fertile condition,
Mm-hmm.
it must therefore be a bit like natural selection. You could actually go out and take, or could you take grafts of the best trees or the best shrubs and bring them to this new ground and improve the quality from the first harvest?
Yes, the process of domestication is accelerated evolution, so you're exactly right. But what we're doing as humans, doing the selection, we're enhancing the process that natural selection took. So we can identify the best tree. If this is the tree we want to meet a particular need, then we can go to that individual tree, We can take buds from the crown of that individual tree, we can graft them, we can root cuttings, we can do what's called marcotting, so there are different propagation systems that bring that tree then into the nursery. Once that tree is in the nursery, you can multiply this tree up hundreds of thousands, millions of times by serial multiplication. So that's exactly what's happened in apples and plums and oranges and all the other common tree crops that we have around the world. And so this process brings the species in from the wild and creates a new crop.
And let me get this correct again. If what you're saying is that if the harvest can improve by a factor of, say, 5, and if enough produce is generated to sell on, there is then the option of buying some fertilizer and putting on the improved product. What difference would that make to the harvest?